Astrid Bishop looked at the test. Negative. Again. For the 1000th time. She crumpled up the test and tossed it into a trash can filled with used hormone syringes. The last 3 years had turned into an endless series of hospital corridors, IVs and disappointments. 4 IVF attempts, dozens of shots, nausea from hormones, all in vain. Gabriel, her husband, regarded what was happening with the cold calm of a successful businessman. "Honey, it's just a matter of time and money. We can afford 10 more tries." Astrid walked out of the clinic restroom, blotting her eyes with a paper napkin. The waiting room was empty. The workday was coming to an end. Only a young doctor in a white coat was typing something at the front desk, occasionally adjusting his thin-rimmed glasses. "Dr. Adler?" Astrid recognized the geneticist who had counseled her a month ago. "You're still here?" Torrance lifted his head from the computer and smiled. He had a disposing smile, warm and a little shy. "Mrs. Bishop?" "Yes, just finishing up some reports. How are you doing?" He stopped talking, noticing her reddened eyes. "I'm sorry. Stupid question." "It's okay, I'm used to it," Astrid tried to smile back. "Sometimes it just seems pointless. 3 years, 4 attempts." "Have a seat." Torrance pointed to the chair next to the counter. "Would you like some water?" He pulled a plastic cup from the cooler. His movements were smooth, almost graceful. Astrid remembered how she'd been struck by his manicured hands and the subtle scent of expensive perfume at her first consultation. "You know," Torrance sat down next to her, "sometimes you just need to take a break. Give your body a break from the hormones. That's easy to say. I'm 28. Gabriel says time is playing against us." "Your husband," Torrance hesitated. "Pardon my indiscretion, but has he been re-examined?" Astrid shook her head. "He thinks it's me. He has a daughter from his first marriage." "She's 15 years old now," Torrance said softly. A lot could have changed in that time. At that moment, his cell phone rang. The screen showed a picture of a smiling man with perfectly styled hair. "I'm sorry." Torrance quickly dropped the call, but Astrid could see the name Mason and the heart next to it. "Your partner?" she asked before she could think. Torrance blushed slightly. "Yes, we've been together for 7 years. He owns a grooming salon downtown." "That's great," Astrid said sincerely. "You know, I've always thought that gay men, that you're more sensitive. Maybe because you're not bound by the conventions of traditional relationships." There was a pause. Torrance was absent-mindedly fiddling with his cup. "I saw your results," Astrid said suddenly. "In the donor database. Perfect genetics, high IQ, excellent health. Did you donate your own research material?" "Yeah, it's part of the job. We're testing new cryopreservation techniques." Astrid looked down at her trembling hands. A crazy idea was forming in her head. "What if," she stammered, "what if you could help, not as a doctor, as a donor?" Torrance straightened sharply. "Mrs. Bishop, it's against the rules. I can't." "Please, call me Astrid." She moved closer. "I know it's crazy, but think about it. You'll never be able to have children of your own. And I would give anything for a child. You have the perfect genes. No one would know." "It's unethical and illegal." Torrance shook his head. "Besides, your husband, Gabriel, would never take a paternity test. He's too proud. And I'm willing to pay. Whatever you want." Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Torrance quickly moved away. "I have to go." Astrid pulled out a business card. "Here's my number. Please think about it." She walked out, leaving Torrance in the empty reception area. He stared at the business card, which read Astrid Bishop in elegant script, and then slowly tore it into small pieces. But he already had the number memorized. Torrance couldn't sleep. Mason was sleeping peacefully beside him with his arm across his chest. But thoughts of the strange conversation with Astrid Bishop kept him awake. He carefully slipped out of bed and stepped out onto the balcony of their penthouse. The night city twinkled with lights. Somewhere out there, in one of the luxurious mansions, Astrid was awake as well. Torrance was sure of it. He'd seen a lot of desperate women in his 3 years at the clinic, but something about her had stuck with him. Her sincerity, perhaps, or the determination with which she'd voiced her crazy proposal. The phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number. "I know it's late. I can't stop thinking about our conversation." Maybe we could meet tomorrow. Astrid. Torrance should have ignored the message, delete it, and forget it. Instead, he wrote, 6 p.m., Bluebird Cafe on Oak Street. The next day stretched interminably. Torrance absent-mindedly admitted patients, mixed up charts twice, and received a perplexed look from the department head. At 5:30, he canceled his last consultation and drove to the cafe. Astrid was already waiting for him. Without makeup and in a simple black dress, she looked younger and more vulnerable. I ordered coffee for us. She slid the cup toward him. Thank you for coming. Listen, Torrance began. What you're offering. $500,000, Astrid interrupted. Cash and complete anonymity. Torrance choked on his coffee. It's not about the money. It's unethical. I could lose my license. No one would know. You said yourself Gabriel would never get suspicious. He didn't even retest. What about your conscience? Are you willing to live with that secret? Astrid grinned bitterly. My conscience? Do you know how I feel every time I see Gabriel looking at pregnant women? Or when his mother insinuates that I'm inferior? I'm ready for anything, Dr. Adler. Anything. She pulled an envelope out of her purse. Here's the deposit, $100,000. You'll get the rest when you're successful. What if it doesn't work? If the pregnancy fails again? Then it's fate. Torrance looked at the envelope. His hands were treacherously shaking. I need to think about it. Of course. Astrid stood up. But not for too long. I'm not getting any younger. Torrance got home late. Baby, you're just in time. Mason pecked him on the cheek. I ordered Thai food. Not hungry. Torrance walked into the bedroom and collapsed on the bed. The envelope of money was in front of his eyes, $500,000. He and Mason had long dreamed of a house of their own, of traveling, about Mason being able to expand his salon. The phone vibrated again. I understand your hesitation, but think about it. You can make 3 people happy at once, me, Gabriel, and our future child. Isn't that why you became a doctor? Torrance closed his eyes. Mason came into the room. What's wrong? You seem strange. Tough day. Tough case. You want to tell me? I can't. Doctor-patient confidentiality. Mason shrugged and went to take a shower, and Torrance dialed Astrid's number. I'm in, but I have conditions. Anything, she exhaled. No contact after the procedure, no attempt to contact me, and the child must never know the truth. I swear. Then meet me at the clinic tomorrow. No one will be there after 9 p.m. He clicked off and sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the sound of water from the shower. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a bad feeling was stirring, but Torrance brushed it away. After all, he really could make someone happy. And wasn't that what his profession was all about? The clinic seemed unfamiliar in the twilight. Torrance never stayed out this late. Usually, the last patients left before 6. He turned on the lights in the lab and pulled the necessary equipment from the safe. Astrid appeared at 9:30 sharp. She was wearing a dark coat and large sunglasses, despite the evening time. Are you sure no one will recognize you? She looked around nervously. The cameras are down for maintenance. The guard doesn't make his rounds until 11. That's plenty of time. The procedure took less than an hour. Everything went perfectly. Torrance's years of experience. As he was finishing the paperwork, the phone went off the hook. Where are you? It's after 10 o'clock. Dinner's getting cold. Torrance quickly dialed back. Running late. It's an emergency. What kind of urgent case could there be in a reproductive clinic? He ignored the message. Astrid had already left, leaving an envelope with the remaining amount on the desk. Torrance locked it in the safe tomorrow. He'd deposit it in his and Mason's joint account. He'd say it was a bonus for a successful quarter. At home, he had a cold dinner and a disgruntled Mason waiting for him. Since when do you stay late at work? He scratched behind the ear of his pet black Zwergschnauzer named Oscar. I used to be on time all the time. Lots of work. A new program on... Don't lie, Mason interrupted. I called the clinic. No one was there after 6. Torrance went cold. Are you following me? No, I was just worried, and rightly so as it turns out. Mason, Torrance approached his partner. You know how much I love you. I do. Mason pulled away. That's why I don't know what's going on. The weird calls, the messages you delete right away. Now these delays. It's work. It's just work. Yeah? Mason took Torrance's cell phone off the table. Then why'd you change the password? Because it's patient confidentiality. It didn't bother you before. They stared at each other across the room. Oscar whimpered quietly, feeling the tension. I'm tired, Torrance finally said. I'm going to take a shower. He locked himself in the bathroom and turned on the water. His hands were shaking. He'd have to be more careful. Mason knows him too well. Any change in behavior raises suspicion. Returning to the bedroom, he found Mason already asleep, or pretending to be. The phone on the nightstand flashed a new message. Thanks for everything. Hope it works out the first time. A. Torrance quickly deleted the message, but it was too late. Mason was awake. In the darkness, his eyes glittered like a predator's. Who's A? He asked casually. A patient. The one you go out with after work? Mason, stop it. You know what the funny thing is? Mason sat up on the bed. I always thought our orientation was the perfect insurance policy against cheating. Turns out I was wrong. You're out of your mind. I'm just helping a man out. Of course you are. And that's why you're hiding your phone and lying about work delays. Torrance didn't answer. What could he say? The truth? It would sound even more unbelievable than the suspicion of cheating. At night, he couldn't sleep again. Mason was tossing and turning, checking his cell phone. And somewhere in the city, Astrid was awake, waiting to see if their risky plan would work. The 2 weeks dragged on endlessly. Astrid woke up every morning at first light and automatically reached for a pregnancy test, but warned herself it was too early. Gabriel noticed her nervousness. Honey, why don't we go somewhere? Take your mind off things. No. She absent-mindedly stirred the cooled coffee. I have a test appointment at the clinic. X-Day came on Thursday. Astrid locked herself in the clinic bathroom with the test. 3 minutes turned into an eternity. When the test showed 2 stripes, she couldn't believe her eyes. Second test. Third, all positive. At the doctor's office, not Torrance's, of course, but another specialist, a blood test confirmed the pregnancy. 2 weeks. It worked the first time. Gabriel greeted the news with uncharacteristic enthusiasm. He ordered a huge bouquet of roses, called his mother, and spent the evening making plans for the nursery. I told you. He kissed her on the temple. You just had to have faith. And wait. Astrid nodded silently. Everything inside her was clenching with fear and elation at the same time. It had worked. She and Torrance had done it. Across town, Mason was closing his grooming salon. The last customer, a pampered Spitz, drove off in a pink couture dress. It had been a rough day, but not as hard as what awaited him at home. He was just looking for the car papers in Torrance's office. They were going to trade in their old Lexus for something newer. A folder fell out of the stack of papers by accident. Donor protocol, fresh date, Torrance's signature. Mason read the document over and over. Sperm donation? His Torrance? The same Torrance who always said their love was the only thing he needed in his life? The phone was ringing off the hook with customers making grooming appointments, but Mason didn't answer. He sat in the darkness of the home office, mechanically stroking Oscar, and waited for his partner to return. Torrance came in late. He smelled of hospital and coffee. How was your day? He asked, kissing Mason on the cheek. Fine, Mason pulled away. And you? The usual routine. Really? Mason stood up. What's this then? He tossed the folder on the desk. Torrance turned pale. I can explain. You can? And how do you explain going behind my back to be a donor? Decided to procreate? To start a normal family? Mason, it's not like that. How? How, Torrance? You know how I feel about kids. We've talked 100 times about never doing this. It's just a job. A job? Mason laughed bitterly. The job is to heal people, not handing out your genetic material left and right. He grabbed his jacket and car keys. Where are you going? My sister's. I need to think. The door slammed. Oscar whimpered. Torrance sank into a chair, wrapping his arms around his head. He didn't know that somewhere in the city, Astrid was clutching a positive test to her chest, and Gabriel was making reservations at the best restaurant in town to celebrate the news. His world was crumbling right now, in the silence of the empty apartment. The phone vibrated. A message from Astrid. Got it. Torrance deleted it without answering. For the first time in his life, success didn't bring him joy. Mason returned 4 days later. He looked lousy, gaunt, unshaven, in wrinkled clothes. Oscar rushed up to him, tail wagging, but Mason didn't even pet the dog. "We need to talk," he said, walking into the living room. "And this time I want to hear the truth. The whole truth." Torrance was sitting on the couch, clutching a clipboard full of unfinished medical reports. He hadn't slept much the last few days, trying to call Mason. He didn't answer. "Her name is Astrid Bishop," Torrance began. "She's a patient at our clinic. 3 years of unsuccessful IVF attempts. Her husband refuses to be tested." "So you decided to help her?" Mason poured himself a whiskey. "Out of noble motives?" She offered money. The glass froze halfway to his lips. "How much?" $500,000. The whiskey spilled onto the carpet. Mason laughed, a hoarse, unpleasant laugh. "Is that how much your principles are worth? Our relationship, our future? What does our future have to do with it? I was just a donor. Once. We didn't talk after the procedure." "I don't believe this." Mason came closer. "I saw your cell phone, messages, calls. These are old messages from before the procedure. You can check the dates. What if the baby's born sick? What if there are complications? If her husband finds out the truth? We have a strict no-contact policy. She knows the rules." "An agreement?" Mason grimaced. "With the woman who paid $500,000 for your genetic material? You really think she's just going to disappear from our lives? She already has. I don't answer my cell phone. I don't read texts. It was a one-time contact." "Then let me see your phone." Torrance held out his smartphone. "History shows no calls from Astrid, no texts. You deleted them." There was nothing to delete. Meanwhile, in the penthouse across town, Gabriel watched his wife. Astrid had changed. A new energy, a strange enthusiasm. She talked on the phone for long periods of time, locking herself in the bathroom. And when he came in, she'd cut the conversation short. Yesterday, he'd heard her whisper to someone, "We need to meet. It's important." And this morning, he found an unsent message on her phone. "Dr. A, please respond." Something was going on. Something to do with their long-awaited pregnancy. And Gabriel definitely didn't like it. Mason closed the grooming salon early. Oscar stayed with his assistant. He had other plans today. For a week now, he'd been tracking Torrance after work. So far, nothing suspicious. Home, clinic, home. But today, something was different. Torrance stayed at the clinic longer than usual. Mason waited in a car parked across the street. At 9 p.m., a woman in a dark coat came out of the building. 10 minutes later, Torrance followed her. The next day, Mason checked his partner's cell phone while he was in the shower. Call history was clean. Messages deleted. Too clean a history for someone who supposedly doesn't keep in touch. Astrid didn't get through first. She called the clinic, got through the front desk. "Dr. Adler, please listen. I'm having complications. Nausea, dizziness. I'm afraid..." "Mrs. Bishop, please see your primary care physician. But you should know. It could be hereditary, in your family." Torrance hesitated. Then he gave up. "I'll meet you at the Bluebird Cafe in an hour." They talked for 2 hours. About health, about genetic risks, about their future child. Astrid was glowing with happiness. Torrance caught himself thinking he was pleased to see her like that. The next meeting was a week later, then another. They corresponded on a secure messenger. Torrance had set it up specifically for this purpose. "Dr. A, I had my first ultrasound today. Would you like a picture?" "I'd rather not, but how did it go?" "Perfect. He's healthy, or she is. It's too early to tell." "Glad to hear it. Are you sure you don't want to be involved in the baby's life?" "We had an agreement. I know, I just thought..." Mason found the correspondence by accident. Torrance had forgotten his phone at home, running out for an emergency call. Secure messenger. Hundreds of messages. Photos from the ultrasound. He was shaking with rage. 7 years together. 7 years of absolute trust. And now Torrance was building some kind of parallel life with this woman, with this child. That evening, he went to the gun store. The salesman talked at length about the different models. Mason chose an AK-47, classic, reliable. "You got a gun permit?" Sure. He learned to shoot in college. His father believed every man should know how to defend himself. Ironically, those skills are now being used for something else entirely. At home, Torrance didn't notice anything unusual. Mason was habitually grumpy, complaining about difficult clients, walking Oscar. The gun lay in the trunk of the car, wrapped in an old blanket, and new messages popped up on the secure messenger. Dr. A gonadotropin test came back high. That's a good sign. Could it be twins? It's too early to tell. But that would be wonderful, wouldn't it? Our children. Astrid, we had a deal. I'm sorry, sometimes I forget. It was a warm spring evening. The lights were on in the lab at the fertility clinic because Torrance was late processing test results. He'd often stayed late in recent weeks, when the silence of the empty corridors helped him focus. The cryo chambers hummed quietly in the corner. It was already dark outside the window, and the bright light of the lab lamps reflected in the glass. Torrance rubbed his tired eyes. The numbers on the monitor were blurring. He didn't want to go home. There was a gloomy Mason waiting with his heavy silence and stares. The door creaked open. Torrance turned around, expecting to see the night guard, but Mason stood on the threshold. He held a Kalashnikov assault rifle in his hands. "What are you doing here?" Torrance slowly stood up from the table. "Thinking about us." Mason strode into the lab, playing with the weapon casually. About how things had changed in the last month. "Mason, put the gun down." "You know what the funny thing is?" Mason didn't seem to hear me. "I really believed that you were special, that our love was special." "It is." "No," Mason shook his head. "You're just like everyone else. You wanted a normal family, kids, an extension of the family. It's not like that." "It's not?" Mason pulled out his cell phone. "Then what is it?" "Our children." "That would be wonderful." "How many times did you meet? What else did you talk about?" "I was just counseling her." "You're lying!" Mason went ballistic. "You've been lying this whole time. I saw the way you smiled when you read her texts, the way you hid your cell phone. I've seen you come back from your meetings, happy, elated. Mason, listen to me." "No, you listen to me." Mason raised his gun. 7 years. 7 years I gave you, and you ruined everything. For what? For a child you'll never see? Put the gun down. Let's talk." "Talk?" Mason laughed bitterly. "About what? About how you betrayed me, our love, everything we had?" His finger rested on the trigger. Torrance stepped forward. "Mason, please, you love me." "I did." The first round shattered the glass of the cryo chambers. The second pierced the computer monitors. The third hit the target. Torrance fell, clutching his chest. The white robe was rapidly turning red. Mason stood over him, watching the dark stain blur. "I really loved you," he whispered. Alarmed voices could be heard in the hallway as guards ran toward the sound of gunfire. Mason lowered the machine gun and slowly turned toward the door. His face was perfectly calm. A cool spring wind blew in through the broken window, playing with the ragged curtains. Somewhere in the distance, a police siren wailed. Detective Raven Sloan arrived on the scene 15 minutes after the call. The clinic building was cordoned off, the flashing beacons of police cars flashing everywhere. The security guard who had called the police was still shaking as he recounted the gunshots. "Where's the suspect?" Sloan asked, pulling on latex gloves. "In the car," the young officer replied. "Didn't resist arrest. Weapon on him." Mason Caldwell sat in the back of the patrol car, staring at one point. His hands were handcuffed and his light-colored shirt was stained with blood. "Mason Caldwell?" Sloan crouched next to the open door. "I'm Detective Sloan. You want to tell me what happened?" "I killed him," Mason answered simply. "With a Kalashnikov. 3 rounds. Why?" "He betrayed me." Upstairs, forensics was processing the crime scene. Gunpowder residue on the walls, shell casings on the floor, broken cryo chambers, and Torrance Adler's body covered in a white sheet. "What do we got?" Sloan went to the expert. "It's pretty clear. 3 rounds at close range, 1 to the equipment, the rest to the victim. Weapon was found on the suspect, prints all over the place. Motive? Personal. They were a couple, lived together for 7 years. Sloan went through the security cameras. Mason enters the building at 2 hours 11 minutes and 30 seconds. Machine gun in a tennis racket case. He goes up to the 3rd floor. 8 minutes later, gunshots. Security comes running in 2 minutes later. Everything's crystal clear. They found encrypted correspondence on the victim's cell phone with an Astrid Bishop. Sloan called her in for questioning. A formality, but protocol is protocol. Astrid showed up the next morning, pale, scared, 3 months pregnant. Mrs. Bishop, tell us about your relationship with Dr. Adler. He was my doctor. He helped me with IVF. Just a doctor? He became a donor, unofficially. I paid him. How much? $500,000. Did his partner know? He found out recently. He found our correspondence. Sloan took notes, even though they weren't necessary. The case was crystal clear. Jealousy murder. Perp was caught red-handed. He had the murder weapon on him. Full confession. In the evening, she would write her report. The dry facts were laid down on paper. Suspect is Mason Caldwell, 35, owner of a grooming salon. Victim is Torrance Adler, 32, reproductive doctor. The murder weapon was a Kalashnikov assault rifle, purchased legally a week before the crime. The motive is a personal relationship. The crime was committed in a state of affect. The suspect pleaded guilty. The phone rang on the table. Forensics sent over the ballistics results. It was a perfect match. The case was closed. Detective Sloan? A young officer came into the office. The suspect's attorney is here. Give him the case file. It's all clear. Sloan stretched and looked at her watch. The long day was coming to an end. Another case for the statistics. Another tragedy born of love, jealousy, and betrayal. In his cell, Mason lay on the narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling. He hadn't gotten a lawyer, didn't ask for leniency, just waited for sentencing with the same blank stare he'd had in the patrol car. Let me help you get your sentence reduced. The elderly lawyer put the papers on the table. We have a good chance of proving passion. 7 years of relationship, sudden betrayal, emotional distress. No. Mason didn't even look at the papers. I want to tell it like it is, in court. This is insane. You're looking at life in prison. I know that. The interrogation room was small and stuffy. Mason sat upright, staring at one point. Handcuff marks on his wrists. You do realize that a clean confession is no longer relevant? The lawyer took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose tiredly. You were picked up at a crime scene, with a gun. I see. Then why? I want everyone to know the truth, why I did it. Revenge? Jealousy? Mason shook his head. Betrayal. He didn't just betray me. He betrayed our love, everything we believed in. Tell me more. We were together for 7 years. We built a house together, a business together, a life together. I never demanded fidelity from him, in the conventional sense. Knew he was gay, like me. Trusted him completely. Mason was silent. It was raining outside the window. What changed? She offered him money, $500,000 for the genetic material. But it wasn't about the money. He got carried away. He started imagining himself as the father, his future child as his own. I saw it in his eyes. I saw it in his texts. But there was no physical cheating, was there? There was worse. He traded our world for theirs, our love for their future. He became a different person. The lawyer made notes in his notebook. It can be used. Psychological trauma, triggered behavior. I told you not to. Mason raised his voice for the first time. I don't want excuses. I don't want extenuating circumstances. I killed him deliberately. Why? Because he chose a different life, where there's room for a woman, a child, a normal family, and I've become a past that needs to go away. But you acted out of passion. No, I bought a gun beforehand, learned how to shoot, picked my time. I waited until he was alone in the lab. Why are you telling me this? Because it's the truth, and the truth is the only thing I have left. I can put together a good defense. The jury will understand. No need. Mason stood up. I'm ready for trial, and I'm ready for sentencing. Do you realize what you're facing? I do, but, you know. He smiled for the first time. At least in prison, I won't have to watch him build his new life every day. Without me. The lawyer looked after his client as the guards led him away. In 20 years of practice, he had never met anyone who was so eager for the maximum sentence. In the hallway, Mason paused for a moment. You know what the worst part is? I still love him. I always will. The cell door closed. Somewhere in the city, a pregnant woman was stroking her belly, unaware that her happiness was built on someone else's tragedy. And in a grooming parlor, a black Zwergschnauzer whined, not understanding why its owner wasn't coming home. Astrid gave birth in early October. A boy. 3 kilograms, 500 grams. The first cry echoed off the walls of the hospital. Gabriel's hands trembled when he held his son for the first time. The contractions began during the night. The labor was long, 14 hours. Gabriel stayed close to his wife, whispering words of encouragement, wiping sweat from his forehead. At some point, Astrid began to gasp. The doctors ran, fussed. The pressure dropped. There were complications. Gabriel prayed for the first time in years. When everything was over and her son was lying on Astrid's chest, a nurse came into the room. "What will you call him?" Astrid looked at her husband. He smiled. "You choose." "Alexander." A week later, they returned home. Gabriel turned an entire wing of their penthouse into a nursery. Bright, spacious, overlooking the park. At night, he often got up with his son, changing diapers, rocking him in his arms, letting Astrid rest. One day, while scrolling through the photos on her phone, looking for pictures of the baby for the family album, he came across an old correspondence. Astrid found him in his office reading the messages, sat down next to him, took his hand. "I'm sorry." Gabriel was silent for a long moment, then pulled his wife to him. "I guessed. I saw the money transfer. I noticed the change in your behavior. Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I knew you did it for us, for the family." He kissed the top of her head. "You know, it's the right thing to do, genetically. Dr. Adler's numbers were perfect." Astrid laughed through her tears. Mason's trial took place in November. It was a short trial. All the evidence was in, confession obtained, life in prison without parole. Astrid followed the news of the trial, rocked her son, read the reports, Mason's picture in every article, the glazed look, the compressed lips. He didn't defend himself, didn't ask for leniency. He accepted the verdict in silence. When Alexander was 6 months old, she made up her mind. Gabriel didn't discourage her, only asked her to be careful. Drove her and her son to the prison, waited in the car. Mason appeared in the visiting room, gaunt and aged. Handcuffs clinked on the table. "Why?" That's all he asked. "I want to tell the truth. About Torrance. I know the truth. I've seen your correspondence." His face looked waxy in the dim light of the lamps. "No." Astrid shook her head. "You saw what you wanted to see. Torrance never thought about me. About us. About the baby. You're lying. We even stayed on a first-name basis. All this time, we've never used you once." She pulled out her phone, showed me the correspondence. "Look, every message he sent is dry, medical, no emotion, no personal attachment. But your meetings..." "The only time he saw me without my clothes on was at the clinic, during a procedure, a cold medical procedure. He didn't even look at me, just at my medical records. And the messages, talking about the future, I wrote those. I fantasized. I imagined this connection. And he just answered, politely, distant, like a doctor to a patient." Mason went pale. No. I saw him smiling as he read. He was smiling at the success of the procedure, like a doctor, like a professional, not once as a father-to-be. Look closely at the dates. He only answered during business hours. Never evenings, weekends, it was purely business. But the money? He took it as a favor, not for feelings, not for a future, for a job, professional medical work. Mason sat, clutching the table with white fingers, knuckles so white they looked like they were about to tear through the skin. "I killed him," he whispered. "Killed him for something that wasn't there." "Yes. Why did you come here to tell me?" "Because the truth is the worst thing you could imagine. He loved you. Only you. And you killed him for his loyalty." Alexander cried in the hallway. Astrid went out, came back with a baby in her arms. Blonde-haired, blue-eyed, just like Torrance. Mason looked at the baby with a paused stare. "He has his eyes," he whispered. "But they don't have his soul in them. Because he never wanted this child, never dreamed of it. Didn't think about you." "No, he didn't. Didn't dream. Didn't think." She clasped her son to her chest and walked out. Gabriel was waiting in the hallway. He hugged them both, led them to the car. Mason was alone. The cell was quiet. Only the dripping of water somewhere. Drip, drip, like the blood from Torrance's wound that night. He didn't think of her, didn't dream of a child. He didn't cheat. He didn't betray. and Mason killed him. At home, Astrid tucked her son in. Gabriel hugged her from behind, kissed her neck. "You did the right thing. He had to know." "I know." They stood by the crib, looking at Alexander sleeping, their son, their family, built on someone else's tragedy but made real. And in a prison cell, the man who killed the love of his life for a betrayal that never happened wakes up every night from the same nightmare. In it, Torrance smiles, warmly, tenderly, and says, "I loved only you." It's a hell he'll live in forever.